We are now in the last chapter of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad. He has titled it A Last Word in his characteristic humble style. This chapter stands out in that his approach to the Kena now is different. While earlier he followed the sequence, the rhythm, and the content of the Kena faithfully, here he stands back, reviews that content. As we saw last time, he approaches the entire message and content of the Kena from the modern perspective of an intellect organizing, structuring the knowledge as necessary for its understanding, more philosophically structured, more rationally sequenced, while the text of the Kena approaches intuitively, builds from one experience towards a greater experience through stages. This stands back and shows you the big picture. As we saw last time, first of all, the basic assertion of this text, of the teaching, is that there are three states of existence: the human and mortal, and the Brahman consciousness, which is the absolute of our relativities, and a third, which is the utter absolute, which is unknowable. And the focus of the Kena is to turn us from the first towards the second, by an introspective process at first. This is the framework in which we have to understand all the discussion. In the next paragraph, which also we saw last time, he describes the consequence of this shift. And the consequence is extremely important because we realize that in this second level of existence, we do not cease to live. We do not cease to think. We do not cease to perceive through the senses. We do not even cease to speak, to manifest. Everything continues, but from a more profound, more real, more complete, and more free and immortal status. The life in the first level of the mortal consciousness is a life bound in the cycle of death and rebirth. The life in this second level of consciousness is a life of immortality. And from a poise of immortality, it can play freely in the game of death and rebirth, but itself remains always immortal, free, absolute, and master of itself. In the same way, the senses no more are bound to a pale, distorted, and limited perception of reality, but awaken to the true sense of our sense, which sees all essentially as expressions of the divine. Everything is a manifestation of the Brahman. In the same way, our power of cognition, of knowledge, of will, are no more bound to a limited operation of mind which can only break up things and reconstruct, never truly finding what it seeks to know, always bound to a narrow perspective against which there is always another perspective that is contrary. Instead, we enter a domain of consciousness, of knowledge, which is free of ignorance, free of limitation and division. It can embrace all things in its scope and is fundamentally error-free in its immortality. Equally, the speech which in the human experience is a limited, self-contradictory and weak expression, is here found to be an all-powerful, absolute and perfect expression of the divine will and the divine creative movement. Everything in this second level of existence is free of bondage and a world of largeness, infinity and immortality. And so he says in conclusion, this movement of ascent is to ascend out of earthly joy and sorrow into a transcendent beatitude. Now, this being the result of this transition, the next question is, of course, how do we make that transition? And Sri Aurobindo, now standing back from the text of the Kena, presents to us the logic of the Kena rather than its sequence of intuitive development. Placed logically, of course, one arranges things in a more structured way, natural to reason. We see two different approaches, or rather two simultaneously different movements. The first, which is a more external shift, and the second, which is a more internal shift. In the first, we begin with what we are experiencing in our life and through our senses of ourselves and the world. In the second movement, our spirit, our essential awareness turns to its own source. In both movements, though, there is a turning away from the appearance to that which is behind the appearance. After all, if the relationship of the higher existence to the lower is in a continuity, if the lower existence or the lower life is only a distorted, limited and fragmented representation of the higher, then everything here links to something in the higher. And so this is the way that is taught. Sri Aurobindo now summarizes this process. This must be done by the abandonment of our attachment to the figure of things in the mortal world. We must put from us its death and dualities if we would compass the unity and immortality. Therefore, it follows that we must cease to make the goods of this world, or even its right, light and beauty, our object of pursuit. We must go beyond these to a supreme good, a transcendent truth, light and beauty, in which the opposite figures of what we call evil disappear. So the logic is obvious. If we are to shift into that consciousness, then obviously we must begin to turn our attention to things which are closer to that consciousness, which belong properly to that consciousness, and disengage from things which belong to this consciousness. And what is the first step? By abandonment of our attachment to the figure of things in the mortal world. The biggest problem we find in this shift is that we are unable to shift because we are somehow bound. It's as if there are cords tying us to the things in the mortal world. And what we are bound to are not even things in themselves, they are a figure of the real things. What we mean by figure, an outline, a rough, crude sketch, representing the thing itself, but not itself the thing. We may take, for example, a map. If you're traveling moving around in the town of Pondicherry, you have in your hands a map. The map may encompass the entire region of Pondicherry, which you are able to hold in your hand. It represents the region of Pondicherry, but is not actually the region. As you move physically, your body wanders around on a motorcycle or a car, or as you walk around and make turns. On the map you represent your position by drawing points, moving the pen, drawing an image. But that picture on the map is not you. The sketch of the buildings is not the actual buildings. And yet one could get lost. One does get lost in the map itself, to a degree that if the map does not match the reality outside, we feel lost. The map shows there should be a road here, you look around and there is only a blank wall. And you're certainly lost. You do not know where you are, you do not even know who you are. Because the map claims you are this at this location, but something is out of sync. The experience of the mortal life is very similar. We are moving from symbol to symbol, but behaving as if the symbols are the reality. The practical result is we are lost. We do not know what we handle, we do not know it for what it actually is, and we do not know ourselves and our place in the world. We are always uncertain, unsure, and therefore we have fear, insecurity, and we always worry whether we are doing the right thing or the wrong. In the midst of this, anything which comes offering to us an instantaneous certainty, we latch on to, we grab. Someone says, oh, but this is what you should do. Ah, yes, you are right. The next moment someone else says with greater force, ah, yes, you are right. At no point are we actually seeing what is right, although it's right there. Because we have fixed ourselves, or we are bound to the map. In the same analogy, while you are wandering around lost in the city, somebody says, oh, it is in this direction. Somebody else says, ah, it's in that direction. And you don't know what is true. Here, there is a binding. The ability to step back or disengage from the binding and look at what is true is compromised by the cord. In the Veda, there is the description of the triple cord that binds the soul. There are 3 ropes with which we are bound. The first is the gross physical body. The second is the pranic life energy body. And the third is our mental body. All 3 have bound us. What does that mean, bound? We are so tuned or plugged in into these 3 that we do not know how to disengage. We have forgotten that actually we are free of these, we are not these. Instead, we find ourselves identified with them. We are body, energy, thought. I am. And if my thought sways me, if my emotion rushes in, if my body feels excited or depressed or tired, I am excited or tired. I am worried. I am. Because of the identification. The nature of the identification is being a binding. It's as if these 3 hold us. If you do nothing, you will remain stuck. And so the first word Sri Aurobindo uses, and it's a very powerful word, he says, this transition must be done by the abandonment of our attachment. You have to abandon, literally throw away from you with a certain forcefulness. What? Not the thing itself, not the body, but your attachment to it. Not the emotion, but your attachment to it. Not the thought, but your attachment to it. Effectively, it is a movement of disengaging from an appearance. So attachment to what? To the figure of things in the mortal world. And what are the figures? Through the gross body, through the physical senses, the things and the forms that you see. This looks pretty, that does not look as pretty. So I will buy the glittering, glossy apple. It's got a shine on it, whereas the other one is dull and brown. Not knowing that there is a chemical which has been sprayed on the surface of the apple to give it a shine, and that is poisonous, it is carcinogenic. But I'm attracted to the appearance. At that moment, if I step back from the immediate attraction and apply my intelligence, recognizing there is this, I may set it aside and choose the other, which I know has not been processed, which has not been poisoned. But it needs for me to separate from the first act of attraction, which was binding. If you observe the same movement in an animal, you will find how deeply the binding actually is. A dog smells and it has to chase and grab that which is now salivating to eat. It sees a car rush by, it has to chase after and bark to be able to fulfill its identity. It's stuck and bound in its nature and the imprint of its nature. The human being is halfway. If we make no effort, we are sucked by this hypnosis of the binding of the senses or the emotions. But if we apply our intelligence, we can stand back from this movement and choose to disengage. At first, the act of separating may be painful because you're as if tearing the attachment. When it comes to things which are farther away, you're not personally bound to, it is easier. When you come to things which are closer to you, your own friends, relatives, children, brothers, sisters, parents, or objects given by them which you treasure, or the things which you value personally and are attached to over time, there is a pain of the separation. And as if to avoid the pain, we do not make the effort. But it need not be painful. If we make the conscious shift in ourselves to recognize, I am not the body, I am not the emotions, and the play of the body, senses and emotions is therefore not me. And it's easy for the mind to take that kind of a poise. By centering yourself in the mind rather than the emotions and the senses, you do not feel the pain of the separation. The actual separation can be made quite easily. The only problem you may have is the habitual falling back. But the pain is not necessary. The pain is there when you are identified with the emotions and then you try to separate yourself from the emotions. Then it's as if you are tearing apart a part of yourself from another part of yourself. Simply to let go and stand back in a higher part of the mind gives you the freedom to disengage without that pain. But that's not enough. Even the mind's understanding of things is a figure of things in the mortal world. And at some point we have to step back from the mind's own attachment. And this, Sri Aurobindo points out, is often a little more difficult. And even for those who are naturally used to living in the mind, to abandon their thought values themselves, to stand back from that, is a bit tricky. But a little bit of skill, a little bit of effort, one is able to get to some point of it. But abandonment means you throw away permanently. When you have abandoned something, it's not you let go to in order to pick it up again. You have to throw away that. You've thrown away that. For what? You must replace it with something else. He says, the logic is, we must put from us its death and dualities of the mortal world, the death and dualities which belong to it. If we would compass the unity and immortality, if you want to turn to the things of the higher existence, you let go of these in order to turn to those. The unity and immortality. To compass. What is to compass? The compass is something which shows a direction. But here the sense is not just compass in the direction, but encompass. To embrace, to include fully, and to take into ourselves. But there is the suggestion of the direction set in order to embrace the unity and immortality. So how do you get to that? Therefore it follows that we must cease to make the goods of this world, or even its right, light and beauty, our object of pursuit. All the time we were chasing for the things which belonged to the world, and now we stop chasing for the things which belong to the world. We will chase after something else, but not the things. Or even on a higher level, we have to stop chasing after the right, the light and the beauty of the world. Now here momentarily we question, but isn't it good to chase after the right, the light and beauty? You will recall several chapters ago, Sri Aurobindo explains how in the world of dualities, everything represents the absolute. But things represent the absolute in a positive way or the negative way. The positive way points to what takes you towards the absolute, which represents something of the goodness of the absolute. The negative way points to the shortcoming of whatever you have got. So the positive side says, yes, you must grow in goodness, you must grow in right, you must grow in light, you must grow in beauty. But the negative way says, whatever you have got is wrong, is insufficient, it is not the absolute. So you are stuck between dualities. And the abandonment of the good, the goodness, is a part of this, separating from the dualities which belong to this. And what you have to do instead? We must go beyond these to a supreme good and transcendent truth, light and beauty, in which the opposite figures of what we call evil disappear. So we turn to this higher good, not just higher but supreme, a truth, light and beauty which belongs to this higher existence. How do we know we are approaching it? The reference is the opposite figures of what we call evil disappear. So as long as you are in the domain of duality, you will have good and evil, and you may have a higher good, but you'll still have a subtle form of evil. Any good can be easily perverted into its evil. Any evil can be undone to become a good. Because after all, they are the same things oriented differently. But as you approach the higher, the sense of the evil vanishes. Everything is seen in terms of a different face of the good. The analogy we draw, and it's easy to see it in this way, look at the forest and the movement of animals, birds and trees in the forest. If you look from the perspective of an animal, the forest is full of danger. At any point, the deer could be attacked by the lion and eaten, it will die, and that is bad. The deer can eat fresh grass and grow, and that is good. If there is the edge of a crevice, the deer could fall, and that is bad. If there is a lack of rains, then you may not have enough food, and the deer will suffer, etc. But you stand back from the deer, let's say widen the scope of the deer, look at the larger ego, not individual deer, but the entire family of deer, the entire tribe of the deer. And still you have on a larger scale the good and bad dualities. But if you step back and look at the totality of the forest, leaving nothing out, the lion eating the deer is good for the lion. The deer not surviving because of some loss of food is good for the forest, because otherwise too much deer is eating up the grass, changing the balance. And so occasionally you have to have these cycles where there is a large scale loss of life because of insufficient food, so that the grass can bounce back and later the deer can bounce back and come to a higher harmony. If you look at the totality of the forest, there is no experience in the forest life that you can say is bad in itself. Everything serves a larger good. And in the larger picture of time, when you see the forest developing across years and centuries, you see how every so-called bad served in some way in the larger capital good. And there is no so-called evil anymore. A similar experience can be had to the mind when you look at the big picture of human evolution, or the way nature develops or works to develop humanity for its consciousness and evolution. And you will see that all the struggles, all the clashes, all the conflicts have served. Not all were necessary, but all of them were made good use of. Some of them became necessary precisely because there was resistance or a refusal to growth or change. And all this you can see from an impersonal perspective and say, yes, only good can come of nature's process. Except the only criticism you will have is, it's too slow. There is so much unnecessary suffering, or so it seems. And even there, if you take a large enough picture of the possibilities of nature's play, you will recognize the slowness of nature's way serves to create greater diversity and enjoy each of the steps of a revolution as thoroughly as possible. And everything serves in some way. This the mind can understand from a very detached, impersonal perspective. Even the heart can be taught to observe from that detached perspective and share in this understanding. But the moment you identify with your own personal consciousness, you say, yes, I understand that, but right now I am suffering and I need to do something about it. So we recognize that there are many levels in which our current consciousness can turn and rise towards that which is the supreme good and a transcendent truth and light and beauty, in which the opposites and the figures which we call evil, they disappear. And we can begin such a process from wherever we are in our consciousness. But the real thing will be when we open to that and experience that directly. How are we to do that? Because the first turn we understand is necessary. But what will be our vehicle? What will be our recognition that we are moving on the right path? What will be the steps that we will take? It's okay to say abandon this, but what do you seek after because you don't have that? So here he explains how to do this. Therefore, we scrutinize them. No, wait, there's one more step. But still, being in this world, it is only through something in this world itself that we can transcend it. So here we are, we have a body, life, mind. We want to get to a consciousness which is belonging to the domain of immortality, above these three. But in order to rise to that, we have to begin with the things we have in this world. It is through its figures that we must find the absolute. And how are we to do that? Therefore, we scrutinize them and perceive that there are first these forms of mind, life, speech, and sense, all of them figures and imperfect suggestions, and then behind them the cosmic principles through which the one acts. So first we're observing, yes, these are the things which are our experience in the world. We have a mind, we are able to think. We have a life and the energy of life. We have the speech and the creative power. We have senses through which we perceive all these things. But behind them we discover that there is some cosmic principle through which that is working. It is to these cosmic principles that we must proceed and turn them from their ordinary aim and movement in the world to find their own supreme aim and absolute movement in their own one Godhead, the Lord, the Brahman. So here's the strategy. You observe these things, scrutinize, look carefully, and you discover behind these things there is a deeper working of the cosmic principles used by the One. But the cosmic principles are fixated on working towards these aims, the lower aims. Having discovered or glimpsed those cosmic principles, we begin to turn them to that, to the Lord, the Brahman, to their own Godhead. Let's look at how this works in the mind first. You have a thought power, you are thinking, you are observing, you are analyzing. For what? To make your life more comfortable, better, to overcome problems and so on. The entire thought power is turned outward. To make your external life and the figures somehow better utilized for whatever goals set. The goals set also are for improving your health, improving your comfort, improving your advantage, gaining more, losing less, etc. So all the goals of the mind and all the objectives of the mind are turned to things of the lower existence. Now we observe that this power of thinking has behind it a deeper faculty. I am able to observe things, I am able to analyze, I am able to compare, I am able to make conclusions, I am able to rearrange and organize thoughts and ideas. I am able to know deeper motives behind these appearances. And so I notice in the introspection that there is a faculty in the mind's working which is free of the specific goals, the specific directions set. It is a deeper power of knowledge which shows me things behind appearances. Having got to that, I can still turn it back to the same goal. Here now I have a greater advantage because my mind is able to see at a deeper level the things which move people, the forces which drive the cycles and events. Or the same power I can turn to its source. Where does this knowledge come from? Where does this power or this ability to know or to act come from? In the mind itself. And the mind turns to its own source of knowledge. What in the mind's working is truly the knower. A kind of an introspective process where you observe the working of the mind and stand back. Now, one of the first experiences one has when one begins this process, well, even before this, how do we make this process effective? The first requirement for this is to be able to train the mind to become quiet at will. When you're able to make your mind quiet, you're able to observe its processes and therefore you're able to modify its processes. When you're able to make the mind quiet, you're able to perceive a deeper layer of working which is behind the surface activity which you made quiet. And this is the mechanism, the means by which you will be able to come to the awareness of these deeper layers. And when you have a first glimpse of the deeper layer, one of the first experiences takes this form. You have an idea or an insight and you rush to think about it or express it either in thought or in word. But you notice there's a gap between the pure knowing and the rushing to think or to express. And there you can pause. You discover then that you can have a knowing which does not yet have a full thought form. It's a very interesting experience. I know I don't have yet the words to express it. I don't have yet the thought even to express it. It's fascinating if you can hold that poise. You notice there is a similar experience that takes place in speech. as you're speaking something, you have just forgotten the word that you wanted to speak. What's that word? That word, what do they call it? Who is that person that I wanted to speak about? You remember that person who was like that? I've forgotten the name or that word. But in your mind's awareness, you know exactly which person you're referring to. You know exactly what you want to say. In a pure thought idea, without word. You've just lost the word at that moment which would express it, that someone else would understand what you're referring to. But in your mind awareness, you have it. Pause there. Play with that. Thought without words. If this is for you now easy, you'll find a similar process taking place in the step just before. The idea comes before it has taken the form of idea as a pure essential idea. You know exactly what you're going to think out. You know exactly the direction in which it will unfold, and even a sense of the steps, but the steps are not formed and the thought is not formed. It's pure idea. And you hold that. And it's fascinating. One could even exercise this. I had once planned to do this as a kind of a training course to use, especially working with Sri Aurobindo's writings, it is much easier. To train people consciously by exercises like this to be able to shift up multiple levels of the mind's working and come to this poise where you are thinking without, or you're cognizing without thought, in pure idea, and idea to idea you hold and operate in your thought. And it's easy to do this when you're studying Sri Aurobindo's works, because when you read the words, you try to feel what's behind the words, what's he saying, what is behind this particular term. You go to the root sense of the word and you find so much that he's intending to express. And in the sentence, there is this whole experience that he holds. And in this way, by abstracting levels, you discover multiple sentences in sequence built for a more complex, more essential experience. And you can go through a process like this to step back and observe and hold that poise of experience. But you could do this equally in the midst of any other life activity. But a dedicated exercise is more helpful because you're concentrated on that effort. In life, you will find the same thing happening spontaneously. Discover this poise, this level of awareness of mind. It's still mind, but it's not bound to words. It's not bound to form of idea. It holds itself as a pure essential idea. And you can even think on that level, idea to idea. And at that point, you're on the borderline of pure intuitive experience. From there is a further stilling of this, and then you enter into an experience which is lit up, an awareness which knows, and knows perfectly within its limits. And then it can move like this, through a series of intuitive flashes. But this process of ascension of consciousness takes place through this process of scrutinizing the figures. Remember, it is through its figures that we must find the absolute. Figures represent the absolute. How? Through a series of reductions until we have the lowest figure. Behind this figure is a more complete or more true figure. Behind that another, all the way to or pointing to the absolute. Therefore, we scrutinize them and perceive that there are at first these forms of mind, life, speech and sense, all of them figures and imperfect suggestions. They only point to the thing itself. And then behind them, the cosmic principles through which the one acts, the powers of thinking, the powers of observation, of analysis, of synthesis. And behind all this, we recognize in their free working, the powers are not bound to this objective. The same powers are operating and we can turn them to that. Or we can as if backtrack from them into their source. It is to these cosmic principles that we must proceed and turn them from their ordinary aim and movement in the world to find their own supreme aim and absolute movement in their own one Godhead, the Lord, the Brahman. Now, you need not have gone through these steps as I described them. It is, of course, extremely helpful if you want to develop the higher faculties of your mind. You could simply instead turn the thought power itself to the Lord. Meaning, instead of thinking of my problems, of my money, of my relationships, of my health, of my immediate struggles, I turn to dwell on the divine. How? In whatever form, whatever aspect, whatever way that you feel most natural and helpful. If it is in some form of meditation, you sit quietly, let your thoughts turn to the divine. In the way you conceive of the divine as the divine presence that fills everything, as the divine love that embraces everything, as the divine knowledge that guides everything, as the divine will that impels everything, or simply your relationship with the divine Shakti, the divine mother, and feeling yourself close to her. And you remain thus in your mind turned to the Lord of the mind and its powers. As a result of such an immersion, automatically the powers which are working in your mind get habituated to thinking of that or turning to that. When this habituation becomes more and more frequent, in the midst of my activities and life work, I still find my mind turning to that. Oh, here I just had a beautiful experience and I remember the divine and I thank the divine. I say, oh, what a beautiful gift from you. Here I have problems and I'm struggling and I remember the divine and I say, please help me overcome this problem. You may be doing exactly the same things as before, but your mind is not self-obsessed or obsessed with the form of things and their figures, but turns to the divine while still engaging with those forms. The result, of course, is over time one begins to perceive that even in the forms or through the forms. And so on, the turn takes place of these powers. So this, so far we have experienced, we have discussed what could be done with the mind and its turn. A similar thing would be done with the life. The life energy, the prana itself, where does it go? The impulse in you of your desire, of your joy of life is to enjoy what? Your senses, your possessions, your activities. And instead of attaching to that enjoyment, we disengage from here and turn to the Lord to enjoy Him or His presence in these things, in those activities. Often we have associated with many of these enjoyments a sense of guilt, because we've been taught, especially in those who have practiced anything of the spiritual practices or read things from the spiritual traditions, somehow inevitably, particularly through religions, the sense of guilt or fear is often imprinted. So you just had good food and you must somehow deny yourself the enjoyment of it, because it's not spiritual to be attached and it's not spiritual to enjoy good food or whatever other experience of life. But the way we would do it instead in this approach would be, you enjoy even the taste of the food, but not for the sake of the taste, not for the sake of the food, but for the presence of the divine which makes it tasty, for the sake of the divine which brings the nourishment in the food. And you enjoy the divine presence. Now at first this may be difficult, so you have an intermediate passage where you enjoy the food, you even enjoy your own enjoyment. Oh, I'm feeling so good eating this great food, I'm being in this comfortable space, whatever it is. And you offer that enjoyment to the one who gives it to you. Oh, I thank you for this, Divine Mother. You give me such a beautiful experience and here I share it with you. You are in it, you feel it, you enjoy it with me. And as a first step, what it does, it disengages your personal claim to the enjoyment. And the moment you're freed from it, you'll find your enjoyment actually increases. When you have a personal claim, you have also the insecurity that comes. This is going to end. I can't eat more, my stomach is full, or at some point, whatever it is has to change. And then I will suffer the loss of it. But the moment I've shared it with the divine, the whole character changes. It is no more me and mine. I'm sharing it, and therefore the enjoyment is increased in the closeness that is experienced because you're closer to the absolute of this figure. Very quickly, that begins to fill more and more the character of the enjoyment until you come to that poise where you're enjoying the divine presence or the divine beauty in the very taste, in the very experience. And this can be extended to every experience. Even if you consider smoking to be a vice, you can extend this experience into that activity. If you find yourself addicted to the vice, instead of feeling guilty and fighting guilt and suffering with the whole conflict, start by offering the enjoyment, sharing the enjoyment. And you will find very quickly a dissolution of the personal attachment. Bit by bit, in the very act of inviting the Divine Mother's presence to participate and enjoy with you, makes for her action to fill things. The logic behind this is profound. The mother used to explain that when you approach her with the best of you put forward, she said people make the mistake of approaching as little angels. So you come with the best of you so that she sees the best and say, oh, you're wonderful. And meanwhile, you've pushed all the nasty stuff behind or buried and suppressed it. And if her interest is in freeing you from that, and she has to now dig through all the layers that you have put, preventing her access. And so she said it's much more useful if you go to her as you are, with the trust of a child. Here I am with all my positive and negative things, and as I am. No pretense, no layers. So she can act directly in you. And here what you have done in the very act of that vice, so to say, you have brought her into it most intimately, in the very enjoyment of the vice. And she can work freely, rapidly, and very quickly. If it is bad for you, the whole thing dissolves. And you discover you can still smoke and feel nothing great about it, or the urge itself vanishes and suddenly it's no more interesting. Or even there's a shift and you find it a disgusting experience and it just drops out, whatever form it may take. I'm tempted to share an incident which I have narrated many times. This is one of the former students of the ashram school who shared this with us. And he said he had just completed his education and he announced to his teachers that he was going to go to Germany and study his particular interest. And after a while, it struck it to everyone except the mother. Mother's permission, she might be upset. And as it turned out, within the hour, somebody came from the mother's office and saying, the mother wants to see you. And he said, oh my God, I made a mistake. So he went with a lot of guilt to the mother. And she welcomed him with a lot of affection, made him sit next to her, and then said, oh, I hear you're going to go to Germany. It's very good. And then she took out a paper and pen and wrote down on it. She said, when you go to Germany, you cannot enjoy the German culture fully unless you taste German beer. And on the paper, she wrote down the best brands of German beer. And she said, you must drink these when you go there. And then she said, you're in Europe and you cannot appreciate the best of Europe if you have not gone to France. And to enjoy French culture, you must drink French wine. And these are the best wines that you must enjoy. And she writes them down and gives it to him. And the poor fellow, as he was narrating to us this incident, he had tears streaming from his eyes. You see what she did there? Knowing exactly what would happen to him when he's in those spaces, she connected all those experiences which he would get stuck into to herself as a command. So now when he goes and he drinks his beer and he drinks his wine, every time he remembers the mother with gratitude, with love, with an open heart. And so she can work on in him, she can carry him irrespective of what he does. Now imagine if she had not done this. He would inevitably have had those things, because being part of a certain space, inevitably he would have been compelled, and every time he would have felt guilty. Every time he would think, oh my God, the mother would be so unhappy, I have betrayed her. And not only the complexes would build, but every time he would shut himself off from light and love, and he would have disengaged from her. What she did was ensuring that in the midst of any experience he had, it would always be with her and with love and openness to her action. And this is the principle which we have to look at in the impulse of life. You enjoy playing this game, you enjoy diving from a height, you enjoy anything. Share the enjoyment and offer the enjoyment. And eventually you will find, you will seek the divine enjoyment in this very activity. And your attention has moved from the figure to the truth behind the figure. In the knowledge, your attention has moved from the specific forms of knowledge to the deeper consciousness and insight behind it. And similar thing will happen with the senses and the speech. When you have a sensory enjoyment, you can stop with the first surface sense, or you can look for the thing behind which makes this what it is. A similar exercise, and a similar exercise in the speech. The speech exercise is somewhat different though. In the speech, before you speak, it was an exercise that the mother highly recommended before you do anything, to stop, step back, assess, and then act. Now, you may combine this with a spiritual exercise, step back, offer, and then act. But in the very act of stepping back and reassessing, you realize half the things you're about to speak or do are unnecessary. And the other half, where they're necessary, the form in which you're about to do it is probably not the best. In that very moment when you have stepped back to review, you find there is a much more direct, simple, or true way of doing the same thing. Something happens, I am upset, I rush, and I create more confusion. I step back from the impulse and I observe, and with the minimum intervention, I'm able to correct, perhaps with compassion and clarity, without agitation and excitement. But this principle now you take into all action, all manifestation, including the specific form of speech. Step back, look at what it is that you wish to do in terms of the deepest consequence. Why is it that you wish to do in terms of deepest consequence? What does this act represent, or what does it manifest? And this will still be a mental exercise, but it will free you from the first impulsive movement of speech. Detach from those attachments. But the deep form of the exercise will be when you pause, turn to and wait for the right inspiration or guidance of what would the divine truths want in this movement. One could again start with the thought process, what would mother want me to do? And you get some hint. Or if the link with the higher consciousness, to whatever height, however small step above one has made, if the link is clear enough, you wait without conceiving, without thinking, and wait for the higher part of you to act. And let it lead the form, let it lead the drive and the impulse. Again, one may begin with simple, small, safe spaces in which one practices this. And then very quickly you will find it will begin to happen automatically in other spaces. But in this way, these three things, as we scrutinize, we discover that we have the forms of mind, life, speech, and sense. All of them figures and imperfect suggestions. They have a deeper, more cosmic working, cosmic principles behind, and those we can turn upwards. How? turn them from their ordinary aim and movement in the world to find their own supreme aim and absolute movement in their own one Godhead. You recognize that the mind itself and the knowledge of the mind comes from that and is an expression of that. Your life comes from that, is an expression of that, and so your actions, speech, and your senses. And you turn and give to that, or let that become more and more the initiator. They must be drawn to leave the workings of ordinary mind and find the superconscious mind. To leave the workings of ordinary speech and sense and find the supramental sense and original word. To leave the apparent workings of mundane life and find the transcendent life. So in this way, bit by bit, even gradually, one begins to find the levels closer to the higher existence, and more our whole consciousness, our whole life is lifted up to this until we begin to live closer and eventually in this higher life, sense, speech and mind. I will see in this whole process a graded sequence of ascension. Sri Aurobindo makes reference to this in the Synthesis of Yoga, and we had recently had occasion to study that, where he explained how in the normal process of the Veda and in this Upanishad, the whole ascension was taken through grades, through levels. And this is one way of doing it. There is also the possibility that by a supreme concentration, one goes straight approaching that, or whatever closeness we approach to that, and stabilize ourselves there, and from there reorganize our life. In practice, both happen. This is the whole point of exercises that we discussed, where you make a concentrated effort, or concentrations and meditations in which we make a conscious effort to rise, to shift, to go within, to rise above in consciousness, and from then there reconnect, re-engage with, but from a different poise, all of our normal workings. And progressively that height moves, re-embracing, re-engaging and integrating. So both movements take place. There is a concentrated effort, and then there is the graded effort taking place in the most surface parts, and the two can assist each other. This is the action through the mind, life, sense and speech. But who is making the action? I, the person. And so the second parallel effort is shifting the center of this I. And we'll see how the two will join subsequently. But this he takes up in the next paragraph. And in the paragraph after that, he shows how one can be in that poise while still being fully engaged, immersed in the divine by being fully expressive in life. And all this comes as a consequence of the effort to shift your consciousness and the powers and faculties of your life, mind, sense and speech into their own higher and absolute truth. So we see the structure now, so far, 3 levels of existence. Our goal is to shift from the lower to the higher, which is our immortality and the purpose of our life. And now we've seen the means by which our existing 4 facets of life experience are turned upwards, and by graded process we ascend into that. And the next step, ourselves as the one who is making this effort also shifts the center, and the two assist each other. We'll continue this next Sunday. You see how different this whole approach is from the approach of the Kena text itself. The rational mind understands. It builds out of it a structure. It builds out of it a system and a practice. Whereas the Kena, because it was not following this logical process, it was going through an intuitive process. The reasoning mind says, oh, this is interesting, but that patch doesn't make sense. Oh, here there is something which is totally ununderstandable. And often in the initial stages, when European scholars met with the Upanishads or even with the Veda, they would find patches which fitted the logic and patches which didn't fit. And so they says, but this must be added text afterwards. Or this must be a primitive text, that must be a later text. But the whole point was, it was an intuitive text and therefore not given to the structure of logic. For the modern mind, Sri Aurobindo offers the structure of logic and bridges seamlessly with the intuitive approach. And so we have the benefit of both. In all his writings, you will find this. The structure of logic he presents intact in the Life Divine or the Synthesis of Yoga. And at the same time, within that logic, he is always offering you the intuitive link, the intuitive steps by which you can experientially be drawn up into that. His pure intuitive expressions are in the form of the poetry. In his sonnets, other poetry, or in his Savitri, where you have the pure intuitive, even over mental and supramental intuitive, drawing you straight into an experience, bypassing the logic, within an overall logical framework which is too large. So you have a big storyline spanning 5 pages, but within a single page, nothing has happened in the storyline, but you have a series of rich experiences and stages of growth, development, knowledge, which have been opened out to you. And so you read, you think you do not understand, but you find yourself changed. If you have got used to the intuitive way, then it is extremely helpful. You see the intuitive logic. Each sentence or each phrase takes you step by step into the experience. But the rational mind says, yes, but nothing happened in the story. Why is he talking of 10 different things? But there are 10 facets of a single experience through which he lifts you. And so when the mind becomes progressively more intuitivized, the logic of intuition is far more rich and complete than the rational mind's structure, which then feels so superficial. And with this now consciousness, when you reread texts like this, which are more, in which the intuition and the logic are interwoven, even reading the Life Divine or Synthesis of Yoga, you will find he's actually giving you more in the intuitive structure than in the logical structure. Where initially you found the logical structure so overwhelming and the intuitive structure was supporting behind, now you find the intuitive content 100 times richer than the logical structure. It leads you to so much more. And this is the reason why the mind appreciates differently at different stages of the learning. I was made aware of a comment somebody made in the 1960s when he was in the ashram, and someone referred to him, do you read Sri Aurobindo? And the man said, yes, that man who takes 10 words to speak something which could be said in a single word. Oh yes, that's true. The logic needs only one sentence, but the intuition needs tenfold more content, which is being presented with for 100-fold more value. And unfortunately, in the teaching of Sri Aurobindo's books or in the study of books, people tend to reduce into the logical structure only. By summarizing a paragraph, you see the logical structure of what it conveys, but you have lost the whole experiential, intuitive content of it. The result, of course, can be sometimes counterproductive. And it will close with this one incident. When one of the students in the ashram school wrote to the mother that in this class where we are studying the Life Divine and the whole paragraph is being summarized, he said, I understand perfectly what Sri Aurobindo is saying in the logical structure, and it's something so obvious, I could have said it. Earlier, when I was reading on my own, I had such deep respect for Sri Aurobindo, and when I go through this class, I find I'm losing respect because everything is so obvious. What's the big deal? And so mother met him and she heard him out, and then she sent instructions to the teacher saying, this boy will now study on his own hereafter. He will not attend this class. Obviously, it was a someone who was on his own reading, he was having the intuitive experience, going into the class where things were dumbed down into the logical structure, there was nothing left. It is just the husk, the outer form. The juice is gone. And reading on his own, of course, he recovered that, and the deeper enjoyment began to fill. This is the reason why Mother discouraged study in the normal sense of Sri Aurobindo's books. And that's the reason why also in our study of Sri Aurobindo's writings, we do not reduce only to the rational, but we make conscious effort to open to the experience and the intuition behind. Otherwise, the point is lost. And so it may have a few more words, sometimes repeating those words, sometimes reviewing the text that we studied last time, but always experientially building and rising and entering the experience more deeply. And then the text has served its purpose. We can meditate on this briefly.